Imagine if the Mexican government paid the cartels $1,600 for every head they got of American citizens. How much chaos would that cause in the United States? Well, if we translate the money that was offered to the Glanton Gang for scalp hunting, they were being paid in today's terms $1,600 for men and $800 for women and children's scalps, respectively. And the $25 and $50 is what was historically offered, but Tovine, while in jail in Chihuahua, says that they were getting paid $100 per scalp, which would make the 108 scalps that they brought back to the city would net them around $400,000. And that makes sense when you examine how they were acting in the town and throwing around money and going around and acting like kings, because we've all had those friends who are like the Glanton Gang guys who, as soon as they get their paycheck, they go to the bar and like blow everything. And when we look at ourselves as Americans and as modern individuals, what is our equivalent of this, of the scalp hunting? And the first thing that came to my mind was the counting of the bodies in Vietnam. And body counting has never really ended, especially in modern warfare. That is inherently tied to money. How many people are we killing? And if we're killing enough and doing a good enough job, the money can keep flowing. One could say, have we even evolved since Blood Meridian and the Glanton Gang, or do we just do it in places out of sight now?
Shooter perhaps dead, 13 were wounded.
Let's count the bodies over again. If we could only make the bodies smaller, the size of skulls, we could make a whole plain white with skulls in the moonlight. If we could only make the bodies smaller, maybe we could get a whole year's kill in front of us on a desk. If we could only make the bodies smaller, we could fit a body into a finger ring for a keepsake forever. I'm not a pacifist. I was in the Second World War, and I thought that war was a just war. Maybe we were wrong, but I still think it was. But I noticed that we didn't count up the bodies of the Germans. We simply said there are heavy casualties in the German front. It's in this war, for the first time, that we've had this disgusting business of counting up every little small Vietnamese body we can find, and counting the heads and arms and adding them up into something. There's clearly something else was going on in this war. Then, diving, the green earth swinging, cheeks hanging back, red pins blossoming ahead of us, 20-millimeter cannon fire, rice fields shoot past like telephone poles. The hut roofs loom up huge as landing fields, slugs going in, half the hut's on fire, small figures running, palm trees burning, shooting past, up again. Blue sky, cloud mountains. This is what it's like to have a gross national product.
And in the Chihuahuan jail, Tovine refers to this guy named Trias, and he is a historical figure. He is the governor of Chihuahua at the time, and his name is Governor Angel Trias, or Trias. And McCarthy says of Trias in Blood Meridian that, quote, he had been sent abroad as a young man for his education and was widely read in the classics and was a student of languages. And interestingly enough, a boundaries maker who was working in the 1800s wrote a 2,000-page memoir about his experiences, and the governor was a part of that because I'm sure he was dealing with them in those contracts because it was the Chihuahuan border. And he says of the governor, quote, General Trias, who was for several years governor of the state of Chihuahua, is a gentleman of large wealth and fine accomplishments. After receiving his education, he went to Europe, where he spent 8 years traveling in various parts. Although he remained most of the time in England and France, he is well versed in several of the European languages and speaks English with great correctness. Of English literature, he told me he was very fond, and he considered that no native appreciated the beauties of Shakespeare and Milton better than he. With Addison and the Belles Lettres, writers of England, he was also familiar. And when they're having the big ball, McCarthy says that that Judge Holden and the governor are speaking in a language unknown to all these other people. And Judge Holden liked to do that because he was so smart. He liked to speak to people in their own native language or dialect. So they were just kind of being extra and speaking probably in some dead language. And the reason I'm bringing up the governor is because we have to talk about in terms of scalp hunting, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but you kind of have to. The settler colonialist mindset and the European domination mindset that had been brought into the American West. Because yes, a couple hundred miles south, the Mexica, the Aztecs were just messing everybody up, sacrificing 100,000 people a year, killing many others. And so senseless brutality was not new to the area. However, the systemization and psychological manipulation of people was mastered by the Europeans. They have been working on that, and that's what we call civilization for thousands of years. That's how Cortez showed up with a couple hundred men at the start and was able to be so successful, because they had a playbook of 15 to 1800 years of how to deal with, savages, as they would call them. And Mexico had just won its independence 21 years earlier. And, if anyone's ever read Pedagogy of the Oppressed or studied history, you know that the new party that comes into power, especially if they overthrow a stabilizing force in a violent way, is not better than the first people, at least for a while. There are a ton of problems that occur because the type of people who conduct a violent revolution are not the best leaders of that new country. But if you take all the risk, you're not going to give over your power to a bunch of nerds. No, you're going to take the reward, and the country is going to suffer because of that. And that's what Mexico was going through. Because it was in such a tumultuous state, the Mexican army had been really reduced to zero. And Mexico is really big. We hear in Blood Meridian about these armies traveling through the desert and how hard it is, and, with men. And so we have, these a military in Mexico, and they have to send an army. Sending an army up to Chihuahua is not such an easy thing to get rid of the Comanches and the Apaches and whatnot. However, around this time, things were getting really bad because the Apache and the Comanches had the balls to be attacking something as big as the capital city of a state in Mexico, like Chihuahua, in broad daylight. And they were starting to depopulate a lot of the border regions. A city and, state functions, obviously, because of the city, but the axiomatic base of it all is all these, the people in the outer populations who are the farmers and the ranchers and whatnot. However, if all those people are eliminated, and once again you're in the middle of a desert, then problems start to occur. So classically, there are three things that you can do. You can either do nothing, you can go, get your own people and go to war, or you can pay or convince someone else to go to war for you. And unfortunately, the Mexican government wasn't, savvy enough politically, because they were bordering the United States, who wasn't going to fall for that, to get someone to help them. So they had to pay mercenaries like the Glanton Gang to help them out. However, there's an inherent problem, because in Blood Meridian, we see a little bit of this. But when you go back and read kind of the history of scalp hunting, 99% of the scalps that they were collecting were from peaceful bands of Indians, or, native the indigenous people of that area, because we're down in Mexico. Also, what is the difference between the Apaches and the people of Chihuahua, especially if they are like all natives, right? The Apaches, I guess you could say they did, and the Comanches, they did come from eastern Wyoming and northwest Nebraska at their like inception point. So I guess that is a pretty far distance. But when you're dealing with physical scalps, there isn't that much of a difference in terms of how can you tell a Chihuahuan scalp from the scalp of an actual Apache or Comanche. You can't. So scalp hunters started just attacking random citizens and taking their scalps to get paid for them. Why would you risk it unless you're a bunch of crazy maniacs like Holden, Glanton, and the gang? And that's actually what McCarthy also uses Governor Angel Trias to show us, is how uncivilized this group is. And there's a scene in this memoir that talks about how they're, when the scalp hunters came back, they would have these parties and they would give patriotic toasts to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and then they would give a toast to the Mexican Revolution, and they'd be like, or like Mexican heroes, and they'd be like, to all the heroes of the Mexican Revolution. They didn't know anybody. They didn't care to learn anything, and it kind of shows this air of ignorance surrounding them. And McCarthy literally steals the line. John Russell Bartlett's memoir starts off with, patriotic toasts were drunk. And in Blood Meridian, McCarthy, while they are in the city with Governor Angel Trias, writes, patriotic toasts were drunk. And when we look back retrospectively at the scalp hunting program, it absolutely failed. Many of the states ran out of money, and it wasn't effective because the Apaches continued their raiding until 1890, and the Comanches did until 1870, when both were, annexed and forced onto reservations that they mostly still exist on today. And it's sad to look back at the Apaches and the Comanches because they were fighting a two-front war with the Americans and the Mexican government, and they never really had a chance to do anything except be raiders. In the Battle of Little Bighorn, it's estimated that the natives fielded 2,500 to 4,000 people, and this will blow your mind. That was the largest recorded native conglomeration, army in history, like in the history of the conflicts with America. We'll take the top number, 4,000 people, you guys. That is nothing. We fast forward 20 years to Gettysburg. Both sides fielded, I think, over 75,000 men each. If we go back to ancient Rome, we are talking about some battles where hundreds of thousands of people were involved. And so the Native Americans, and this is, obviously because of the population drop, because of diseases and colonization, they were very low, but it was also, more importantly, because of the tactics and people like Angel Trias, who knew how to divide and conquer people. He knew to keep the people away from each other so they could never band together. Because if we look at early Native American populations, before they were wiped out, not just by diseases, but by colonization and starvation and whatnot, they could have easily, if they came together, fielded an army with hundreds of thousands of men. Imagine an army of what would our history books look like? Obviously, we probably still would have won in the end, but that would have been a very crazy force to deal with. And especially if they had guns, because, you look at warfare at the time, what was the fastest vehicle in 1815? Well, shit, it was the fastest vehicle in 4000 BC in warfare. It was the horse. The train hadn't come around, there were no cars yet, so the horse was still the fastest thing. And the Native American armies had a somewhat proficiency with their cavalry and their horse riding, and with the addition of guns, they would have stood a decent chance with their mobility. There's a great concept and a great book I'm not remembering right now that goes over how Caesar's army of legionnaires would have won in the Battle of Waterloo if they would have fought either of the sides. That their ability to be fast and to take out cavalry would have overridden like gunpowder and cannons, because they wouldn't have been scared. They were trained well enough to follow commands and follow them through. And once they got into close, hand-to-hand combat and kind of got through that initial death barrier, they would have slaughtered, these British and French armies that had not anywhere as near, probably 10% of the experience in terms of sword and spear tactics that Caesar's legionaries did. And so I'm saying this because I don't know how a fielded Native American army would look like. I guess if they were well trained, obviously, but most likely it still would have been taken out by superior military tactics. But if they got creative in a Genghis Khan type way, or got very organized in more of a Caesar legionary way, they could have stood a chance, especially against supply-stricken armies coming down to Mexico, coming to the West. They were relying on supply chains that could have easily been disrupted. However, we really did a number on the psychology of, indigenous people, and they weren't able to field that. And if you guys want a great book on this, there is one called Empire of the Summer Moon, excuse me. And I love this. This is a bunch of firsthand accounts from people dealing with the Comanches, or even the Comanches themselves. It's a wild book. It's very graphic. So go check that out. Let me know what you guys think of the scalp hunting in Blood Meridian, the philosophy behind it, any other thoughts that I maybe missed. I also have a video on the currency and economics of Blood Meridian that gets into this on more of a financial and philosophical level. So go check that one out right now.